Thanks for joining. And in fact, I wanted to start this one by saying thank you. Thanks to everyone who's contributed so far, the technical authors, and also the contributors who have. I think we've had 11 or 12 issues now that have been completed, and I hope they've given people, some confidence, and that people have learned something from those, because I think we've also really learned from helping people see those issues land. For Snapcraft, there were a couple of things that I merged just this week. 2 updated pieces of documentation that updated things that were years old and out of date, which is a bad situation to be in. But the examples were for like auto tools packaging and Java packaging that we just didn't have the experience to update, and I think that'll make a real difference to people visiting the documentation in the future. So yeah, thank you for everyone for continuing to engage with the Documentation Academy and for the work that everybody's doing. Another thing I wanted to mention, a few weeks ago, I said that Sally, one of our technical authors, had contributed a kind of a getting started guide to a lot of the ways that we work at Canonical, not Canonical specific, but to the tools, the open source tools that we use, including Git and Sphinx and Read the Docs as well, which is what some of our documentation is using. And I've now merged that into the Open Documentation Academy repository, so that it's part of the main site. If you wanted to take a look at it, it's inside the Getting Started directory, and you can read what she's done. And maybe I'll share the screen and show you what it looks like, because Sally's put a lot of work into this. I'll just share the screen. This is I've made it full screen for myself, which isn't ideal. This is the Open Documentation Academy GitHub repo that we've looked at a few times now. And because I merged the pull request with Sally's guide in it, it now exists in the main branch, that we're in the Getting Started directory. And getstarted.md is probably the best place to start. And because GitHub knows how to render Markdown, you actually get a very nice presentation. Admittedly, it's in the dark mode that I have set up for it, but if you have light mode settings in your browser, it'll be in the inverse of this. And so this guide includes getting started with Git for macOS and for Windows. It's quite diagrammatic, which is really useful if you're beginning with Git and with some of our systems, or you've been interested in some of the earlier documentation academies we did. And also it can be built upon. I mean, it's already quite comprehensive. You can see that there's Windows subsystem for Linux, so you can do all of this on Windows. There's a guide to Git, basics on using the command line interface. If you've never had to use the command line interface before and want to give it a try, that's actually something that we should do in the future, is show that you can do all of this without using the command line, which is something we've not quite covered. I'll make a note of doing that. And of course, the guides using Git as well. So take a look. If you think anything needs changing in this, or you want to add something to it, by all means, create an issue and we can create a task to do it, and people can work on that as well. It'd be great to make this part of a more substantial guide. I also wanted to reiterate that while a lot of the issues that we have at the moment are sponsored by Canonical projects, because they're the things that we're working on, behind the scenes we are actually working hard to really broaden the remit of the issues that we work on. And we will be writing a more formal kind of open invitation for other projects to get involved. But if you're watching this and feel like you're a custodian of a project and know a project that would like to get involved, please don't hesitate to get in touch. We very much want this to be like an open resource, and so that our technical authors and anybody else who may want to get involved in reviewing or contributing can do so. it still feels in the early stages, but we don't want to hold back in opening up the repository to other projects. And I know, Kubuntu would be great, for example. Some of the other Ubuntu flavors. We've had Thunderbird interested, and we're going to reach out to other projects as well. The plan. I'm just looking at my notes. Sorry. The plan for the rest of this documentation office hours was Robert and I were going to have a kind of an informal presentation and discussion really about some of the more common documentation frameworks that we've worked with and that we still have to, that we work with currently, and also some of the kind of formatting and structuring methodologies that people use for documentation, by way of like a brief introduction, in the same way that we did with tooling last time, and the same way that we did with text editors the time before that, just as an introduction to kind of some of the things that we deal with as technical authors, and some of the things you may deal with as you kind of continue on your documentation journey. So I don't know if you wanted to start this off, Robert. We've got a few things that we want to cover, and maybe the two of us will kind of chat about these as we go through them.
Yeah, why not? So yeah, what we talked about was that we would just basically probably skim the surface right now, but at some point in the future, it might be worthwhile and also interesting to dive a little bit deeper and explain some of the intricacies and also interesting aspects of some of the frameworks that we might be talking about today. So I would start off by mentioning that probably all of the stuff that we're going to be talking about shares the common characteristic of being based on an idea that's generally called topic-based writing. That means that the structuring and the categories, if you will, of what is being written about are based on, for want of a better word, topic. Of course, topic is an overloaded term, and different frameworks and different guides use it in different capacities. But the basic idea is that instead of writing walls of text or prose, you try to structure the content based on some criteria, and that criteria could be at various levels of granularity, but most frameworks usually work with some kind of categorization that usually is also divided into topics that are focused on action and topics that are focused on sort of explanation or reference. So the first ones might be procedures or how-to guides or tutorials. The second ones might be reference or explanations or stuff like that. And now the different frameworks that are in use across documentation are usually based solely on the structure that they use or on the types of categories that they use, but sometimes they also go further and they are dependent on a particular markup language. An example of that, and a very commonly used framework, is DITA, which, unless I'm mistaken, I think it's something like a Darwin Information Technical Architecture or some such.
I didn't know, actually.
Help me out. I've forgotten the
information type, I think. Darwin information type.
Okay. Thank you.
Architecture.
Yeah. And
information typing architecture.
Right. So that one has been in use for a very long time, and it does pretty much what I was talking about. It divides up the content into action-based and referential-based information topics. And for example, at Canonical, we use a very similar framework that's called Diátaxis. It probably can be argued that it's been inspired by DITA or by other such frameworks. That one, again, divides content into different categories. Again, they can be roughly divided into action-based and reference-based or learning-based. I suppose that it does. We probably shouldn't go into the nitty-gritty details of these. Suffice it to say that the main motivation or the main benefit of using a framework like that is that there is a level of consistency introduced into the content, and therefore both for the authors or the developers of the content as well as for the consumers of the content, there is a nice sort of a familiarity to it. So once you get used to it, it becomes much more simpler to both develop the content because you have in your head a very specific idea on how you can divide up the information that you need to present, and in what ways you can present it, in what ways you can structure it, as well as for the user or the reader of the documentation. They once they get a little bit used to what they can expect, they know that by the information that is being structured that way, they can always expect a more or less similar look and feel to the documentation, regardless of what content it is. You would always know that you would find a particular kind of information in a place or in a topic titled in a certain way. So I believe that consistency probably is the key aspect to these. And yeah, go ahead, Graham, just jump in.
I was just going to say that also, I'm sure you were going to get onto this, that we've all probably experienced projects that have kind of naturally evolved their documentation. Somebody's created an initial set of documentation, and then other people have started added to it, and as a project has kind of got bigger and more contributors, nothing has ever changed. That initial kind of skeleton of documentation has just outgrown all of its original purpose, and it very quickly becomes quite chaotic and very, very difficult to manage. And I think that's another aspect of these kind of frameworks or organizational structures is that they limit or they challenge you from letting that happen, which you don't get by people just thinking, well, documentation's easy, we'll just start with the README and then we'll split this up into different things, because very, very quickly that becomes unmanageable. And it's also really, really difficult to backpedal. So difficult, in fact, that it's usually better to just start again. And I think that's something that these kind of ideas really help with.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And it also sort of plays well into what I wanted to mention next, is that while these kind of frameworks are supposed to be helping people, of course, oftentimes you can sort of think about that help as being a very useful constraint, meaning that it sort of forces you into some sort of a kind of thinking, and in so doing, it enforces both the consistency as well as a bit of a discipline, and therefore the documentation not only is structured in a certain way, but also the content tends to be it does not grow out of hand in a similar way that Graham was mentioning. When you know that a certain category is reserved for instructions and certain category is reserved for reference, for example, then you tend not to mix the two, and it does not tend to run away from you and become, in the end, unusable and very hard to maintain and so forth. And that brings me to the last topic that I wanted to mention on these, and that is the maintainability. Because development of documentation or any kind of content, basically, that needs to be updated to be kept up to date with the developments of the product or application or whatever it is documenting, usually tends to become more of a maintenance burden, of course, as the longer the product and the documentation set exists. And what people often don't realize is that the actual writing part or the development part is, in the end, probably a smaller part of what needs to be happening in order for the documentation to be useful and to remain useful. So one needs to be very careful about budgeting, sort of capacity for the maintenance part. And that's what these frameworks help with, because it allows you to sort of easily imagine what will need to be happening in the future in order to keep an eye on the content not becoming obsolete, and so that content rot doesn't slowly creep into the documentation side. Because once you have it structured into different categories, then you would know that, okay, so if only the version numbers change, that amounts to that kind of a change in these kind of topics. If the instructions for installation change, and I only need to change these kind of instructions in these kind of topics, and so forth. And also, when talking about maintenance, what a structuring like that, sort of an expectable consistency facilitates is the ease of onboarding other people onto the project. Because if you can expect something in there, it's sort of like having a good manual for servicing a car. If you were to just dive deep under the hood without knowing anything about the about the engine, that it might be difficult. But if you have it all parceled out, and if you know that the individual pieces of documentation can be serviced one by one, then getting new people to contribute or getting new people to fix things becomes a lot easier.
Yeah, one thing that I think we found really useful at Canonical is that thanks to Diátaxis having this kind of common syntax or terminology for the sections, for the explanation part, the how-to part, it doesn't necessarily, you can talk to engineers who've never worked on documentation, or product managers, or even marketing people, and everybody is talking about the same things. We're talking about the same requirements in the same place for the same piece of documentation, where before we had anything like that, and it doesn't have to be a Diátaxis, but before we had any kind of agreement on the frameworks that we should be using, you ended up having a long conversation even before you got to the parts that needed to be updated, or the pieces that were missing, or where something should go. You could have endless discussions about whether something should be inserted alongside a tutorial, for example. How much explanation text do you put alongside a guide to installing something? And having a framework like this means you don't have any of those conversations anymore. I mean, there are some downsides to it, but it saves an awful lot of time and fragmentation that comes from other people implementing things in their own way. And I think that's been really beneficial. It means that we also, with the Documentation Academy, we're saving time in not having those discussions necessarily, because there's already such a well-established terminology for where things should go.
And maybe to continue on from that, I was thinking that we might mention some of the more common markup languages that are in use in documentation. And again, not to go very deep, but just to mention some. I suppose that the majority of people might be familiar with Markdown, probably the most ubiquitous one. Also, unfortunately, one that lacks an official specification. So many implementations are there. They're abound with slightly different aspects and slightly diverging quote unquote improvements. that maybe different implementations or variants of Markdown are potentially not compatible with one another. That being said, the basic Markdown is a very simple language that allows for some basic semanticity, and that's probably key to it, and to the majority of markup languages, that it allows people to develop content in a semantic way. And what is meant by that is that the look of the document is not really the key that is left up to the rendering software or engine, but what is important is the marking, that's where the markup comes from, of the different elements. So regardless of how you want to render your headings and your links and your paragraphs and your indentation and so forth, that does not really influence the way the document is authored, as long as it is authored in a correctly semantic way. Basically, you just, within the document, within the source code of the document, you mark what is supposed to be a heading and what is supposed to be a link, and how do you differentiate between a paragraph and a blank line and so forth. And then the rendering engine or rendering software, or perhaps content management system, takes it away, and they render it based on a theme or based on whatever idea the author of that engine has. So that's Markdown. That's probably the simplest one, and it's implemented in most of content management systems that they can render it, as Graham before showed. For example, on GitHub, the presentation is very nice. Then probably I would say the second most common one of the simple ones is AsciiDoc. It probably used to be reStructuredText, which I feel sort of has fallen out of favor lately, but they're quite similar. I would say AsciiDoc has developed a little bit further at this point and allows a little bit more flexibility. But of course, with more flexibility comes just a little bit more complexity. But both reStructuredText and AsciiDoc are also very easily readable and can be consumed both in the raw form without really having to, switch different gears in your brain and filter out the markup itself. And then, of course, a very popular one, but that's also not being used that commonly anymore, is DocBook, which is an XML-based markup language. And as a nerd and geek in the same person, I'm very much partial to DocBook because it's an extremely well-developed language that allows for some really advanced magic to be happening with the content, with the source code. It being based on XML, it is widely supported in various advanced tools, and it really allows for very powerful parsing. But the downside is that the learning curve there can be a little bit steep, and it's not as eye-friendly when you open a DocBook source code in your text editor. Then it's bound to be cluttered with various levels of markup. So that it's not as easy to read. Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I was just going to, maybe for people who are unfamiliar with formatting outside of Markdown, that I don't know, would it be fair to say it's a kind of spectrum of potential functionality? It's not just talking, we're not just talking about how text documentation appears because of the flexibility of the things that we're talking about. We're also very much talking about what you can do with it. So as in Markdown, for example, there is there are very few ways to reuse content, for example. So if you wanted reference terms in one place and you wanted to insert them in another place, it's very difficult to do that. And that's part of the reason why there are several different types of Markdown formatting, and people have tried to solve these in different ways. And as you get more complicated sets of documentation, you often find yourself only wanting to document something in one place, and then reusing or reinterpreting that in different ways in different parts of the documentation. And really, I think that's kind of the spectrum of syntaxes that have kind of evolved to try and handle that with really, for me anyway, XML at one end of it, where everything is kind of distinct and in ways that you can mark up and describe and reuse. You're kind of free to create elements to do that almost. And then with Markdown at the other side, which is really almost like flat text with the bare minimum added to it.
Yeah, that's a very good point, and one I sort of neglected to mention. But yeah, I would say that I was describing Markdown and AsciiDoc as being very close to one another. But of course, AsciiDoc, even though it is still fairly simple, as opposed to, for example, DocBook that is XML based, it still allows you to do things like conditional formatting, for example. It has variables and things like that. So to a degree, it almost resembles a programming language. You can do includes and so forth in a language like that, and it's still kept pretty simple, which I would say is probably a testament to some good design. But of course, it does not allow for that type of flexibility that Graham was describing that is possible with XML. The rendering and the interpretation and the parsing of the language can be really very dynamic. I also wanted to mention that as a sort of to put it in context, the notion of markup languages, that markup languages exist not only for text content or for documentation, but pretty much everyone interacts with one particular markup language almost on a daily basis, and that is of course HTML. HTML can probably be thought of as a bit of a dumber sister to XML. XML being the lady of markup languages, HTML being the sort of slimmed down version that's available for the web. Another example would be SVG, which is a markup language that is available for graphics, for vector graphics, and that basically is a way to describe in a textual form and basically any kind of complexity that can be displayed on a screen. It could be anything. It could be text. It could be evolving fractals. It could be basically anything, as I said. But it's still a markup language that uses its own particular form of syntax. Another excellent and very popular markup language is LaTeX, which is of course based on the Tech publishing platform, and that is a markup language that, while simple in its syntax, is an extremely powerful way of presenting documentation for print publication, especially. And so, yeah, I just wanted to put these as examples to sort of cap it as what markup languages can also be used for.
That was a fantastic overview. Thanks, Robert. I just realized that there's so many other things that we could talk about in terms of, SVG. One of the things you can control it with Git, which is really good. And there are other diagrammatic languages like Mermaid that you can use. And these mean that you can kind of edit things in text and track them in the same way that we do the words in the documentation as well, which is important. Yeah, Peter, go ahead, ask a question.
I was going to ask something closely related to what you were talking about. Do you have any sort of preferences or guides around using things like SVG, Mermaid, Dot even? Are they, which fit best with Markdown and Git?
Yeah, that's a really good question. In fact, with the discussions that we're still having internally at Canonical, we've not settled on one, because maybe you found this as well. A lot of it depends on the tooling that we have to build alongside. If we kind of settle on Mermaid, for example, then at Canonical, we've got a web team who would then have to implement the kind of actions to take to incorporate in the publishing actions that actually generate the documentation. And so we've not been able to take it as far as we could do. I think for me, Mermaid looks good. I don't know if anybody else has another opinion. Yeah, Ruth, go for it.
Not another opinion, but I think it really depends a lot on the use case and what kind of pictures or images, diagrams you plan to have. Because I think in general, SVG is a safe choice because you can pretty much do anything in SVG and it's going to display okay, and it's going to work fine with Git. But if you have anything that can be generated automatically, of course, having something like Mermaid is a very good idea because it's so much easier to update. So you don't need a tool to update it. If you, for example, just want to change a line of text in there, you just go in and change the text file. You don't need to generate anything and it'll just show up correctly right away. So I think there's not like one answer to this. It really depends on the context, and you probably, it's probably a very good idea to have some kind of generation in there where you really just have a text format of a graph or a diagram. But in addition, have the possibility to just add SVGs or auto screenshots, which then probably would be PNGs. So those would kind of be in a completely different category. But you probably always need both because you can't do everything with diagrams.
I think it's also mentioned that we try, screenshots and diagrams are really useful, but we try to be very circumspect in their use because of the maintenance burden. Because screenshots are great, and I think if there are ways to automatically build screenshots, but we've not found one that we can incorporate into our tools. And if you can't do that, then they quickly become out of date, and they're very difficult to manage, and they're very difficult to deliver. So even though it's slightly harder in the beginning, we often try and avoid using screenshots and diagrams. In a similar kind of, they fall into a similar category. They require more effort, but yeah, something like Mermaid at least means that if the name of something in a diagram changes, you don't have to go to the trouble of re-rendering it. You can just change the text file, and also you have a log of that changing.
And also makes it simpler with considerations such as localization. Because if you have a screenshot, if you end up with a number of languages, then you need to take care of, it's not only regenerating one screenshot, you have to do a whole bunch of them. And if there's a slight change, then it becomes a nightmare. And of course, the screenshot scenario might not be exactly the same in all variants of the software. For example, various dialog boxes and so forth might be presented a little bit differently in the different languages. So yeah, having something with described truth definitely is more scalable.
It's not searchable as well. That's the other thing. And while it may, and describing what's happening in words is, more translatable. Although I've had discussions this week where we've been talking about a project creating a Grafana dashboard, and that's very difficult to kind of talk about without just showing the dashboard, and sometimes that's the best option. I don't know if that helps. I know we haven't been able to give you a definitive answer, Peter.
Well, yeah, there probably isn't a definitive answer. Depends on context.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions or anything else they'd like to bring up related to this? If not, I will stop the recording. And if anybody wants to ask any questions off the recording, then you're more than welcome to.